Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Transit Caucus meeting. I know this is a big day since we actually have a floor session on the House of Delegates side of things, and I'm sure the Senate is meeting today as well. Just a heads up, I texted some of you on Friday, but one of our veto overrides today actually is a transit bill. It's on the WMATA side of things, the WMATA operating subsidy cap. So feel free to jump in if you see me taking too much fire from folks on the floor over it. With that, our speaker this morning is the President and CEO of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, Brian O'Malley, who is probably no stranger to anybody on this Zoom, but is a fierce advocate for transportation and particularly transit solutions, really statewide, but obviously with a focus on Central Maryland. And he is going to update us on the Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan, which is something the General Assembly required the state to begin working on in 2018 from a Learman amendment to a bill we passed. And so with that, let me turn the floor over to Brian to give us an update.
Great, thank you so much. You know, as advocates, we've been having a chance to talk to transit advocates around the country more this year than ever before with the pandemic and the need for emergency federal relief for transit. There's been a lot of organizing, and we bragged to our counterparts around the state about the Maryland Transit Caucus. We're really excited that all of you are doing what you do and create this platform where we get to come interact with you. So it was exciting to get the invitation, and it's great to see all of you, and thank you for what you do. This presentation is an update on the Regional Transit Plan. It's exciting to see something tangible now after you know, something that was sort of theoretical, and that was an amendment to the Maryland Metro Transit Funding Act in 2018. Essentially, you know, it came from the sense that the last time the Maryland Transit Administration had updated its vision for the future was the early 2000s. There was a 2002 regional rail plan, and in the aftermath of the cancellation of the Red Line light rail project, there was sort of a vacuum. You know, where is the agency trying to go? What does the future look like? There were some one-off projects being promoted, but nobody really knew, like, what were the priorities? How does it all add up to something that's greater than where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? And so there was a need for a forward-looking plan. And Delegate Learman worked with Delegate Corman, got the amendment put in, and it passed. It's now, the provision that I'm talking about is section 7-301.1 in the Transportation Code. And so it required that by October 1st, 2020, that was the deadline, MTA had to produce a regional transit plan. And they did. They met that deadline despite the pandemic. And the advocates were very active throughout that process. I'll talk to you about what I like and don't like about the plan, and give you sort of the nuts and bolts of the main things you need to know about it. But before I dive into that, I think we should address a couple of sort of key questions that are kind of like elephants in the room. The first one is, should we even be talking about a regional transit plan during a pandemic? We have an immediate crisis. Why are we taking this sort of lofty 25-year look into the future? And I would say that for the exact reasons that I listed before, we are at a competitive disadvantage to not be looking 25 years into the future. So we can respond to crises, but we have to also have our eye on that horizon so that we're ready to compete for private investment, for federal opportunities, et cetera. When you look back, you know, if some regions after September 11th said, oh, we have a crisis right now, we can't look 25 years into the future, others had their act together and brought tons of investment and had improvements during the 2000s with federal investment and private sector investment, places like Denver, places like Salt Lake. In fact, Salt Lake, it's been reported, took advantage during the recession in 2008 and 9 of really competitive rates, because the industry that builds these projects was hungry for work, and there weren't many projects happening. And so they were in a strong position to move forward. So we want to position, and that's why it's critical that we have this. We sort of have to walk and chew gum, as former President Obama and others have said. We have to deal with this crisis, but we also have to be looking 25 years ahead. Another key question is, this is a plan for Central Maryland. What does that mean in this plan? Central Maryland is in the name of my organization, and so I can tell you firsthand, it means different things to different people. But in the case of this plan, it's talking about 5 jurisdictions: Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Howard County, Anne Arundel County, and Harford County. And those are also jurisdictions where MTA's core bus and rail systems operate. Now, there are aspects of MTA, particularly the MARC commuter train and the MTA commuter bus, that extend far beyond that Central Maryland region. And so another key question is, well, what about those services? How do we look to the future for those? There is a statewide plan underway. It's actually due this fall. It's something that Secretary Slater asked for when he became MDOT secretary. And this plan that I'm talking about today will sort of feed into that. The statewide plan is a little bit farther looking. It looks 50 years in the future, and it's a little bit sort of high, 100,000 foot level. This plan is, call it the 30,000 foot level. This plan gets into some specific projects and recommendations and objectives. Two will talk to each other, and this elements of this plan will feed into that one. I'm going to drop in the chat for you a link to the statewide plan for those of you who are interested in it. And that's under development now. And again, it's due in the fall. And then the last sort of elephant in the room question I want to address before I get into the nuts and bolts you need to know about this plan is, what does it have to do with the Transit Safety and Investment Act? That's something that hopefully you're hearing about, because it's a bill that's moving in both chambers. It's the #1 priority for my organization this year, the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. What I like the analogy of a house, that we have a crack in our foundation, and the Transit Safety and Investment Act says we have to fix the foundation before we can build any improvements to our house. This plan is looking 25 years into the future and saying, where do we want to be in 25 years? What improvements do we want to make? But we have to do that on a solid foundation. So we need both. We need the Transit Safety and Investment Act to make sure the foundation is fixed. And then we also need to be looking ahead. So those are the key questions. Now I want to tell you sort of the overview, what you need to know about the plan. And I'm going to drop in the chat a link for the landing page for the plan. And there you can get all kinds of information. This is a MTA website. And it includes a link to, well, actually what I'll do, I'm going to give you the one more link, excuse me. This one is on that page, but I'll provide it here for your convenience. This is for the PDF of the document itself. The name of the plan is Connecting Our Future. And I think the first thing I want you to know is that it looks 25 years ahead, and it will be updated every 5 years. So it took a year and a half to put together. So you release it in October of 2020. Come 2023, it's going to be time to start talking about a 5-year update again. But hopefully by that point, we'll be seeing some measurable progress. And I want to talk about the way it's organized. Let me see if I'm able to. Yeah, I'm not able to share my screen, but that's fine. I won't hit you with.
I'll give you the authority. Hold on.
Oh, you'll give me the authority? Okay, great. Because what I'm going to do is show you a nice overview page then. Okay, there we go. So this comes from the executive summary. It's page 5 of the plan document. And what I want to show you here is just sort of how the bones of the plan are set up. So you might notice on the page that there are 6 little icons under the column that's headed objective. So those are 6 objectives. Those are 6 things that are going to get better as a result of this plan. Service is going to be faster and more reliable. ridership will grow, access to jobs and opportunities will increase, the customer experience will improve, the provision of transit will be more equitable, and the agency will be prepared for the future, meaning keeping up with safety regulations, technology, and things like that. One thing that's important to note is that these are not, sometimes you'll see plans where the goals are very sort of mom and apple pie. They're so fluffy that who could argue with them? But these are actually measurable. And they a set of measures, you see the measures column next to each objective. And better still, there's a baseline and target for each of those measures. So you as the Transit Caucus or as legislators could ask the MTA for accountability throughout this process. For example, take the first one. Under the objective, provide faster, more reliable service, there's a measure that on-time performance for core bus will improve. The current baseline is 70%. That was based on the plan year. 2025, they want it to be 85%. And by 2045, 90%. So you can check in with them. Maybe this year it's a little too early, but say 2023 when they're getting ready to begin the next 5-year update. You can ask them for a progress report. Where are we? Are we getting closer to 85%? And if not, what interventions do we need to do to get there? So this is a great tool for you, I believe. It's definitely a great tool for advocates because it gives us something tangible to talk about rather than just griping that the bus is always late. We can check in with something measurable. And I do believe what gets measured gets done. That's kind of a cliche, but I believe it applies here. And so we're pleased with the things that they're measuring and very pleased that they were bold enough to put in baseline and targets. Another thing I want you to know about the bones of the plan is that there are initiatives which are the means by which the plan proposes to achieve results. So this page is sort of showing you the overview of the results they're going to produce. And then they have these initiatives, which are how we're going to get there. And the three main types are strategies, transit network improvements, and regional transit corridors. So strategies could be something like expanding the transit signal priority. So transit signal priority is the timing in the traffic lights that allows if a bus is approaching or a light rail train is approaching, if the light's green, it will hold it green a few seconds longer so the train can get through. If the light's red, it'll turn it to green a little quicker. And so that gives transit vehicles a slight edge to make their journey faster. That's an example of a strategy. Transit network improvements are improvements in places that need service but lack demand for all-day high-frequency service. So these are places that are not maybe dense job centers or urban downtowns, but that have some need for transit. And so the plan tries to talk about things they can do for those places. And then the regional transit corridors are corridors with high demand for high frequency service or planned demand. They do look at planned growth and try to be prepared for that. And I want to give you a little more, pay a little more attention to that one because I think that's important and I want to call it out. In fact, I'll start with the map on page 38. They identified 30 corridors in the Central Maryland region, and the map on page 38 shows you where they're all located. Those are sorted into early opportunity, mid-range opportunity, and long-range opportunity corridors. And they're listed on page 37. So you can see the early opportunity corridors in the green rectangle on page 37 of the plan. Now that's a lot, even there's 11 there, and that's a lot to implement in the early term. But I can tell you that right out of the gate, they're working on doing corridor studies for 2 of these. One is the, it's actually a combination of 16 and 17, which is from Ellicott City through West Baltimore into the Convention Center, and then through East Baltimore to Bayview. If it sounds familiar, it's quite similar to the red line alignment, lo and behold, which might, if you've been around since the 60s, sounds familiar to the east-west route that was planned in the 60s. So we still need an east-west spine in the Central Maryland system. The other one is the corridor that runs north-south from the Towson area to South Baltimore. And so those are both being studied. They involve multiple jurisdictions. In the case of the first one I mentioned, Howard County, Baltimore County, and Baltimore City. And in the second one, Baltimore County and Baltimore City. And so these need to be studied a little further. I know people get frustrated when we talk about a plan and then another plan, but believe me, this is drilling down into, you know, service planning, looking at actual route alignments and alternatives. So this is the way these things get done. And the idea would be to take corridors where there's already a fair amount of ridership and figure out how do we grow that ridership? How do we provide more frequent round-the-clock service to attract more development, give people better access to jobs, et cetera. The last sort of nuts and bolts thing I want you to know about is that there's a 5-year implementation plan. And I'm going to give you a link to that in a minute, but just for now, understand.
Oh, wake up, wake up, wake up.
Oh, we good? Just know for now that there's a 5-year implementation plan that includes items for all the strategies and initiatives mentioned. And they're creating a new implementation coordinator position at MTA, and there's an implementation team. Okay, next thing, I just want to share some opinions. Hopefully that's interesting to you. I'll keep it brief, but I'll tell you 2 things I don't like and 2 things I do like about this plan. You might have noticed I glossed over the transit networks part, transit network improvements. One of the things I don't like is that I find that part confusing. And so I'm not the best person to brief you on it, but I feel like it's sort of, they were trying to please everyone with this. And one thing you need a plan to do is zero in and focus on priorities. And so the transit network improvements is sort of telling places that aren't laid out to support transit, some things that they can be doing. There is a guide that the MTA has developed to work with the jurisdictions on how to make places more transit supportive. That means like things like sidewalks and locating, designing job centers so that if you arrive by transit, you don't have to walk across a sea of parking to get to the employment location. But I find that part a little vague. It could be a little more specific. I'll tell you 2 dislikes. The second one is I feel like it buries the lead with the early opportunity corridors. They don't give you a map of just those 11 early opportunity corridors. They show you a map of 30. And as you know, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so we need to, you know, it's hard. It makes some people disappointed, but you have to say that we have certain priorities. And I think in reality they do. It's just not clear in this document. It's behind the scenes clear, but not clear up front. I think that right at the beginning of this plan, there should be a clear map of the first corridors that they're saying we should be working on. So that's the negative. Let me switch to the positive. 2 things I like. You might have picked up on it. I really like the measures and targets. And I talked about that before, so I won't dwell on it here. The other thing I like is the implementation team. They're serious about working on implementing things on this plan, and they were serious. They were prepared for it. It wasn't like they got to October 1st and said, oh, there, and then sort of took a breath and tried to figure out what to do. They had things in place. They were setting up the implementation team before that deadline. And so I will close with 2 things. I want to tell you about the implementation team, and I want to say 3 things you can do. Do we have time for that? Delegate Corman? Cool. So I'm going to drop in here a link for the page about the implementation team, because this is something you can keep an eye on. Let me get into the chat. Sorry. Moved up here. Okay. So I'm dropping in. Oops. There you go. That's a link for the landing page for the implementation team. I'm going to go to it on my browser too. Hopefully you can see the implementation team here. So this has representation from 4 interest groups: the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization for the region, the 5 regional jurisdictions that I mentioned that are involved, the 4 counties and the city. It has advocacy groups, including I'm with the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, also Accessible Resources for Independence, the Get Maryland Moving Coalition, and Transit Choices. And it has business organizations, the BWI Business Partnership, GBC, and the Greater Washington Partnership. And the implementation team is meeting every couple of months and looking at the strategies and working with the MTA to start implementing stuff. There are 30 strategies that they're looking at for the first 5 years of the plan, and 22 of them are already in progress in year 1. And I can give you examples. An example of a strategy is an additional 5 corridors of transit signal prioritization. They're working with Baltimore City and talking to the counties about where would be good fits for that. Another strategy is increasing the number of bus shelters located in low-income areas. So that gives you some of the flavor. Some others are more like studies, certainly those 2 corridor studies that I mentioned for the early opportunity corridors. So the implementation is happening, and I think MTA is taking it seriously. What we want to see now is for this to begin to show up in budgets. And I was pleased that despite all the cuts, there were line items for the corridor studies that are in the Consolidated Transportation Program. We also want to see things begin to show up in the county's priority letters. The counties have been at the table for this, and that will be a test of how serious they are. So let me close by talking to you directly about things you can do. One thing I would suggest is ask for a briefing from MTA on progress on the strategies. So you saw that there are 22 that are underway right now, and there's supposed to be a total of 30 in the first 5 years. So they can tell you what's happening and you know, how it's going. Another thing is especially during budget briefings, but during conversations with MDOT and MTA, ask which implementation strategies are getting funding in the CTP and which do not. Ask them to tell you, was this just a paper exercise, or are they serious about implementing it? Look for evidence of that in budget briefings. And then the third thing you can do is, and I would suggest maybe waiting a year or two, maybe in 2023 or so, ask for a briefing on progress on the measures and targets. They've given you a really helpful tool here with these baselines and targets. So it makes it easy for, I mean, it's going to be clear cut. Either they're meeting those targets or not, or they're on track to meet them or not. And then if where they are, that's great. And where they're not, you can ask for strategies on how they're going to get there. So I'm excited that I think this is going to be a useful tool for your work. It's definitely a useful tool for the advocates. I think the delegates who were involved in getting it added to the Maryland Metro Transit Funding Act a few years ago, and look forward to talking with you about it today and over the coming months and years.
Brian, thanks so much. Do folks have questions? We can either use the raise hand function, or we're a relatively small group if people just want to speak up. We don't have to make it that formal. Brian, the thoroughness of your presentation has once again silenced all questions.
Very thorough.
I have a question. This is Robin.
Great. Go ahead, Robin.
Thank you, Delegate Corman. Thank you very much, Brian, for this great overview. During the process, when the plan was being developed, I heard, rumblings in the transit advocacy sphere. People were really concerned about this plan being unambitious. And I know some very well-informed folks who were really disappointed, but your presentation makes it look about as good as we could hope for, considering all the parties involved. I'm just wondering if there's anything to the complaints that I heard. Is there anything else missing from this report that we should press for or we should be aware of, other than the feedback you just gave, since you were in all the rooms in the conversations?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and you're spot on. That those have been conversations. I've had it internally, with my board and our staff and partners. My opinion is that let me say, luckily we have notes from the Get Maryland Moving Coalition from before this process ever started about what we were hoping for and what we feared. And that's always a healthy thing to go back and check, because I think your opinion evolves as the thing rolls out. But I think we were afraid that this would be so sort of vague and fluffy that it wouldn't have measures and targets. And I think it was a win and a pleasant surprise. I don't know if surprise might be too strong a word, but it was definitely a win to get those very tangible, accountable measures and targets in there. We feared that that Governor Hogan, because he had canceled the red line, would not allow a state agency to have a plan with an east-west corridor in it, even though we really have to be talking about that to have a regional system. And that actually emerged as the top priority. So that was a fear that we had that turned out to be unfounded. That is in there. I think, though, that the critics wanted to see something with clearer priorities, like what are we going to build right away? I have to say, this is definitely my own opinion, not speaking on behalf of all the advocates, but I think sometimes we want to see a shiny object project and overlook how important improvements to the bus network could be. Not just important, but impactful. In terms of who rides the bus and how many people would benefit if we could make the bus system faster and more reliable. I think, this plan doesn't wow you with a shiny object project unless you read it. You kind of have to, like I said before, they buried the lead. You have to dig in there to find those early opportunity corridors. They're in there, but they don't lead with that in the executive summary. So I think there's a lot to work with here. I think we could actually make people's lives a lot better if we do some of the things in this plan. And that's what I'm focusing on, is trying to make sure we implement these things. And if we didn't dream big enough, we've got another shot in a few years to update this plan.
Right.
Let's have a conversation about actually implementing some things and then decide if we didn't dream big enough or not.
Right. Thank you for that. One quick follow-up. I learned that there is in Baltimore County, in the Timonium-Towson area, I'm not sure whose legislative district exactly that is, but in any case, there is talk about doing transit-oriented development projects in the vicinity of the light rail stops up there. And there's a conversation happening, not a lot of robust advocacy for residential development near the transit stations. And I raised this in this group here among my Transit Caucus colleagues, because even though we've got this plan in front of us, which is very good and we're lucky to have it, there are decisions being made right now that are opportunities right now that could go sideways or deliver less than they could because we're not actively in conversation about what's happening. The person who talked to me about this TOD on the light rail in Towson Timonium area was really disturbed that the NIMBYs up there are fighting, apartments and et cetera, TOD, because of the historical antipathy to, working class housing and racial integration. And I think we need to be ready and active as a caucus, help each other, join together, not just to fight for this plan, but really pay attention to decisions that are being made right now. And I wonder, Brian, if you had any insight about how we could be better at that.
I think first lesson is don't look to the MTA for leadership on addressing racial justice as part of this process. They will comply if you ask them to address that issue, but they're probably not going to be out in front on it. And we saw that, the first draft of this plan had one of the objectives of this plan. Remember, there were 6 objectives. One of them is be equitable. First draft of the plan addressed ADA compliance, but it didn't address racial justice. And advocates had to fight and say that you can't have a section on be equitable and not address that issue. It's very much a part of the history of what's been built and what hasn't been built. And it's very much a part of today of what we deal with when we talk about improvements to the service. And so I think the members of the Transit Caucus can be leaders on that. I think the Senate has the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Commission or team, I forget the right term. Make sure they understand that transportation and public transportation is a racial justice issue and talk about it. Those things are totally intertwined and connected. And there's a lot of stigma and sort of misperception about what happens to a community when it has public transportation. So
Thank you for that.
It's a sticky one. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Delegate Corman.
Thanks, Delegate Lewis. Delegate Ruth.
Thank you so much. I apologize for being off camera. I'm actually driving at the moment. But I did want to follow up on that, the question about equity, and mention that I do have a bill in the, I believe it's HB 1204, but I can't look right now because I'm driving, but it's the Transportation Equity Analyses and Assurances Act that really aims to center equity throughout not just MTA, but MDOT planning, and I would certainly love anybody to take a look at it. Thank you.
Great. We'll make sure we look at that one.
Thanks, Delegate Ruth. Senator Young.
Yeah, thanks. I always get frustrated when I look at these things. 40 years ago, I started pressing the state for a 50-year transportation plan. I guess it would have been almost up by now. Mm-hmm. Maryland is not that big a state, and the Frederick, Baltimore, Washington, Annapolis, Harford County areas, to me, are a region. And is there any planning unit in MDOT that is ever going to look at a long-range plan of how we interconnect everything? And I've seen us in roads and not so much in transit because we aren't building much new. that we just keep responding to growth instead of planning out where it should be. In the mid 80s, I got together with Montgomery County, Frederick City, and tried to get the state to cooperate to lay out the right of ways to bring Metro to Frederick. And we actually did. And Montgomery County actually reserved some of those right of ways, and we did a few. State never participated. Is there any hope that there's ever going to be a unit there that really looks long-term and how the whole state is coordinated? Or will my grandchildren be about this?
It's a great question. It's one that we get that comes up quite a bit. I think, the hope side of it is that it hasn't been a priority in recent decades, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be. And so if enough people are talking about it, it could become a priority for the state. Another piece of the hope is that there is this statewide transit plan that's underway right now that looks at WMATA and the locally operated transit systems and MARC and commuter bus and this Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan. And the whole point of that is to take a 50-year look and see how these pieces fit together and prioritize where should we be trying to improve connections. There's also something to be said for planning at the metropolitan region scale. Voters around the country support taxing themselves to invest in transportation improvements at a high rate when it's on the ballot. It's something like 79% in the last 10 years or something like that pass. 79% of ballot questions pass. But they do better when they're at the metropolitan regional scale than they do statewide. And I think that's because if you get too zoomed out, if you're covering too much area, taxpayers get jealous that somebody else is benefiting more than they are. If it's at the metropolitan regional scale, you sort of have this sense that if they're investing in these corridors, it's going to improve my job prospects, it's going to improve my property values, it's going to improve my quality of life. And so I think we have to look at both the regional scale and the statewide plan to figure out how we tie it together.
Yeah, I mean, again, back in the 70s, we proposed a plan, Baltimore, Washington, Frederick, and Annapolis form a diamond. And there ought to be interconnectivity between all of them, plus high speed between Baltimore and Washington. Won't get into arguing what kind that should be, but it ought to exist. But we couldn't even get MDOT to look at it. Well, I know you can't answer that. Just expressing a frustration that I think should have been looked at decades ago and still should be. And
do you know Jamie McKay, who works at MTA? Have you ever crossed paths with her?
I know she is. I don't know her well.
She's great, and she I believe lives in Frederick and is working on the statewide transit plan. So you might want to check in with her on where some of these ideas are fitting in.
I'll do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Any other questions or comments for Brian? All right, well, Brian, thank you again for the thoroughness of your presentation and all your advocacy on this, but also everything else you've done, over the years. You've sort of been the architect of forward-thinking transportation policy, at least the 6 years I've been in the General Assembly. So thanks for all your work. Everybody, I think this is our last sort of scheduled meeting, but more could be added. We're just trying to figure out if, what times work with our sort of weird schedule in this very odd 2021 legislative session. But I will see many of you later, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Great. Thanks for the chance. It's great to talk with you.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
being here and for your presentation.